Today we're going to work on making pie crust. So no matter what pie you're making, just like on the cakes, like I said that time, the same principles will apply. So we're going to start off with how to make our crust. So we want to, for class, and like I said, we're going to do everything in the most efficient way for our classroom. So we're going to line a measuring cup with plastic wrap to measure the shortening. You could use butter in the assignment that you're working on today. You're going to go over why you would use certain fats and what fats you wouldn't want to use in a pie crust, along with what liquids. You'll also see different recipes that call for different types of fats and liquids, so it's a matter of personal preference and what you're looking for in your product, like we've talked about with all of our bake shop ingredients. So we line it with plastic wrap just because it's easier to clean in the end. So I'm going to, for this recipe, get a half a cup of shortening and level that off. Make sure that you use your spoon and really push it down in there to make sure that you get it all over. And then I pull it out and there's enough plastic wrap that I can just wrap it around the top. And then I like to stick this in the freezer until I'm ready to use it, just so that the fat's nice and cold. Remember, in this case, we don't want our fat to incorporate all the way with our flour because we want it to be flaky. So we don't want a crumbly pie crust, we want a flaky pie crust. So we're going to not have our fat all the way mixed in. So a fat we wouldn't use would be oil, because that's going to mix it all the way in. And then you've got an oddly chewy pie crust, which is not normally what you're looking for. So I just wrap that, I place it in the freezer just so that it's nice and cold. I want to use ice water for my crust. I want to maintain cold temperature of the fat, so I want to do as many cold ingredients as I can. Some people will even freeze their flour. I'm going to use a fork to toss water into the flour mixture. Oh, it appears as though, yep. So after this, I'm going to cut in the fat, and I'm not sure where that picture went. I'm going to cut in the fat. So to cut in the fat, I can use a pastry blender, or I can use 2 forks or 2 knives. You can use your hands, but in this case I don't really recommend using your hands because if you think about it, your body temperature is going to start melting that fat, and you just put it in the freezer for a reason, because you want it to be cold. So we're going to use cold water, cold fat, and use some sort of a utensil that's not going to make the temperature rise to cut in that fat. Just like when we made biscuits and scones, we want it to be cut in, but you don't want it to be all the way combined. So it's going to look like you mixed oatmeal and flour together. So it's going to look a lot like that. And then I'm starting to add some flour, and I want to, again, not use my hands. I want to use a fork to toss that around. And then as soon as it's starting to clear the sides of the bowl, a lot of people will use a food processor for this. As soon as it's starting to clear the sides of the bowl, then I'm ready to dump it onto a lightly floured surface. So I had some flour on there, and I could press it together with my hands, and I could see that it's going to press together just like when we're making biscuits, but it's not going to be extra much moisture in there at all because you want it to be flaky. So I kneaded that just a few times just to make it stay together, and then I wrapped it in plastic wrap, and then I'm going to place it in the freezer for a few minutes while I make the pie filling, because again, the colder it is, the better. So I like to put mine back in the freezer while I prepare my filling, and then I like to put it back in the freezer again after I actually shape the pie crust. So you can also freeze pie crust, so that's where you would do it at this point. So sometimes you can make a double pie crust. I know I have a few in my freezer right now, so I would just make a double batch and I would wrap them both and then just keep another one. And then you can thaw it out and you can roll it, and then you can skip all that other steps and you're ready to just roll out a pie crust. So next thing I'm going to do is place my cold crust on a lightly floured surface. I knew I needed a little bit more flour for this one. I could tell, so I just put a little bit extra on there. I'm going to roll it to a circle. I'm going to use my pie pan as a comparison for how big it needs to be. I'm going to put this there, and then I can see that it's going about 2 inches beyond the pie plate, which is what I need it to do. I rolled it out, and then you can roll it back over the rolling pin. This seems to be our most successful way to do it in class, though. So I normally take an offset spatula and I just run it under the edges just to make sure that it's not sticking. And then just as I'm rolling it, or I'll flip it a couple of times if I need to make sure it's not sticking. But otherwise I'm going to fold it in half, and then I'm going to fold it in quarters, and it makes it really easy to transfer to the pan. So I can pick up this, and then I of course want this. I'm just going to unfold it So I want my center point in the center of my pie pan, and then I will just unfold it. So I'm going to unfold to half and then unfold to whole. And you can adjust it a little bit if it's just not quite on center there. So do that as you need to. And then I'm going to use a sharp knife, a paring knife or a utility knife to trim the edges if I'm making a one crust pie. If you were making a double crust pie, like a regular apple pie, you know, with a lattice top, or maybe a blueberry pie with just some slits in the top, then you'd want to have it hanging over the edge, fill it, put the other crust on, press them together, and then trim it. Because if you only have this much to work with and you're making a double crust, it's going to be a lot harder. So if I'm doing a lattice top or anything like that, I'm going to leave it, or I might trim just a little bit, but I'm going to leave it, and it's not going to be trimmed and pretty then. And then you can crimp the edges, or you can take a fork and you can just tamp the edges and make it look nice, you know, just a little design on the outside. My grandma gets really creative, and she just does a regular outside, but then she takes all the extra little pieces and makes little leaf cutouts and puts them on the edges. She is Martha Stewart's kindred spirit, I think, besides the jail part. And she just puts the leaves on the edges, and she'll even paint them with food coloring. So you could make a different kind of pretty edge if you want to. So then I filled it. I'm making a Toll House pie in this case, and I still have all my flour out. So I did a Toll House pie, so it's like chocolate chip cookie pie. So fill and bake the crust. Sometimes I need to blind bake. Blind bake is going to be cooking it at this point. So the only problem with blind baking is that you don't have anything weighing it down, so your pie crust is going to want to bubble up. So to avoid that, and you're learning this in your assignment today as well, you can dock it, which is taking a fork and just lightly pressing holes in it so that there's no spots for air bubbles to be created. And or you can use pie weights, and pie weights we have a whole bag of them. Just these little round white weights that we have, and they're food safe, and you just fill the bottom of the pie pan with them, and it gives it some weight. Otherwise, without any weight, it really wants to bubble up. So if you need to blind bake, like if you're making a cream pie, you wouldn't bake your filling, you're just going to bake your crust, then that's what you would do. A couple of you guys are doing that. For the remaining pie crust, and the reason I left my flour on my counter, I like to roll it out in some sort of just circles, or you could do shapes, fancy shapes if you want to, like I was talking about my grandma. And then I'm just going to roll that out. I'm going to cut it into something, brush it with melted butter, sprinkle cinnamon sugar, and bake. And they bake for about 20 minutes, or you could just cut them in strips or however you want to do it. But these are just delicious. They're little cinnamon sugar crunchy things, and those you can eat that day. Your pie, you're going to have to wait for it to cool or wait for it to set, but you can go ahead and eat these the same day as our lab. So that's the end. All I'm looking for, depending on what kind of pie you're looking for different things. If your pie starts browning too quickly, you can cover the edges with some foil if you need to. I think that's about it. So there is our pie demo.